I've called this talk, Cyber Threats, the new Cold War. I'm not the kind of first person to, I'll probably rob that, I forget, but I'm not the first person to refer to it in that particular way. The UK National Intelligence Services have advised the top 300 companies in the UK that you should assume you have been compromised. There you are. You have been compromised. Now, the guys can tell you why they said that and what that means in practical terms. But not being an IT person, but knowing something about threat management and risk management and so forth, I would say that effectively it's not so much that we have a cyber war. We have an economic war. Yes, you've got foreign governments involved, but from an Irish perspective, it's more a case of kind of the threat of loss of information. Espionage is the fancy word that we'd use. But cyber in the UK, you can Google today a thing called the UK National Security Strategy. The Tories, when they were in their manifesto, said we will create a National Security Council, we will publish a National Security Strategy, and they did that last October. And on page 27 of the document, you'll see one page, all the risks, 3 tiers. Risk number 2 is cyber threat, second only to international terrorism. Imagine that. Imagine that. And it is number 1 in terms of a threat to critical national infrastructure. Number 1. I mean, when I started off in this game about 20 odd years ago, I mean, and you talked about critical national infrastructure, you spoke about locks, keys, fences, CCTV if it worked, and security guards and so forth. Now it is cyber, right? 9/11 happened, and the US were very quick to respond. They created the Department of Homeland Security, and they said, okay, let's identify all of our critical national assets. And they identified just under 80,000. And they're all the sectors: nuclear power, the obvious ones, transportation, postal and shipping, agriculture, information technology, water and banking, and so forth and so on, right? That's the kind of profile. And you can reduce that down to Ireland's kind of profile. The same kind of headings, different numbers, obviously, right? But what they did was then they said, okay, so we have 80-odd thousand. We can't mine them all. So we're going to whittle that down to 2,500. And they got to 2,500 critical national infrastructure assets. And the criteria they used, this is very important, the criteria that they used for identifying those assets were, number 1, they used vulnerability to attack. Vulnerability to attack. And the second one that they used was the consequence of that attack. Now, Europe, kind of after 9/11, is kind of slower to respond because we're kind of different cultures, different languages, different this, that, and the other, and you had proposals and green papers and communications and so forth and so on, and you ended up then in 2008 with an EU directive. It's an EU directive that outlines the procedure for the identification of European critical infrastructures. European critical infrastructures. And the way Europe organises itself, and Paul tells me this is a matter of debate at the moment, but currently, at least, Europe would say the top 3 pieces of infrastructure that we are most concerned about are, number 1, energy, and the subsets in there are gas, oil, and electricity, as you can imagine, transportation, and ICT. They're always the top 3. And then you've got the others, water, food, and the order of those can change depending on the country in question. Now, in the UK, the UK have kind of notched things up beyond the EU directive. And in 2004, in the UK, what they did was they passed a thing called the Civil Contingencies Act, 2004. And you now have a thing called the Civil Contingency Secretariat. That's part of the Cabinet Office, right? It kind of looks at kind of policy level issues, but primarily around kind of, civil mobilizations. For example, in 2007, the UK had the largest mobilization of resources since World War II, arising from the coastal flooding events that they experienced in 2007, right? In the context of critical national infrastructure, and cyber is a number 1 threat for it, they have created a thing called the Centre for the Protection of Critical Infrastructure, the CPNI. The CPNI, who owns it? MI5 owns it, right? That's the level of attention they are given this thing, right? One of the aspects within that is it's not quite often very clear whether an attack is sponsored by a foreign government or by a competitor. And so the stuff needs to come into a crossroads at a security services level. The bottom line is that the train has left the station. There's regulation coming down the track. Irish people, we tend to be very kind of lackadaisical about these things. We have to have more initiative because we don't have the resources that the Brits have. We certainly should follow their lead nevertheless and have our ears wide open. Listen to people like Paul Dwyer and Paul Gillen. They'll tell us a lot of common sense, having deciphered everything that's going on. In Ireland, in fairness, resources are being mobilised. I'm to understand that the kind of structure, the entity that will own critical national infrastructure is a thing called the Office of Emergency Planning, staffed by military and civilian folk with, I understand, the Garda Síochána having an oversight, talking directly to government departments and so forth. There's an exercise currently taking place where government departments are being told, identify your critical assets. Remember the US, the big dial thing there? Part of the discovery now is that, well, gee, you know, most of the assets, we don't own them. They're owned by private industry. So now you have to identify, okay, so what are we going to do to tell them to protect themselves and so forth? And we'll have some more about that in a moment. Across Europe, most European countries, like Ireland, are following the EU directive. Interestingly, I'm told by one of my colleagues earlier on that Denmark is maybe taking a different route. Why? It had the Koran issue. It feels particularly a threat, and so it might notch a bit up. I don't think they've sorted that out yet.